Nestled in the heart of San Francisco Bay lies a solitary island, shrouded in both sinister history and modern mystery. The island, once known as La Isla de los Alcatrazes, was home to some of the most dangerous criminals and violent offenders the United States has ever known between the years of 1934 and 1963. In the years following its closure, it's believed many former inmates are tied to the island, even after death. The sound of banjo music, haunted tunnels, and the horrible thing that waits in cell 14D are only some of the things that await you here, for the gloominess, misery, and terror that once had a grasp on the island has never dissipated, and the reported creature with red eyes might still be sleeping in its depths. Though the prison is now closed, it remains as active as it ever was. I'm your host, Nick, and this is Chapter 30 of the Insidious Agenda podcast, titled Locked Up: The Haunted History of Alcatraz. As you enter the Alcatraz Museum today, you're met with a picture in gold underneath a chilling quote: "Break the rules, and you go to prison. Break the prison rules, and you go to Alcatraz." Known for being home to criminals of the worst kind, and in one of the most isolated areas imaginable, the former inescapable penitentiary, known lovingly as the Rock, wasn't always a prison. Before we explore the sordid, horrible history of the Alcatraz prison, it's important we go back to the beginning. The first time the island was ever mentioned was in the charting of San Francisco Bay in 1775 by Spanish naval officer and explorer Juan Manuel de Ayala, borrowing from the original name that was given to nearby Yerba Buena Island, La Isla de los Alcatrazes, or, as it's more commonly known, the Island of the Pelicans, was given to Alcatraz Island by English naval officer Captain Frederick Beechey. The island was so overrun with pelicans and all sorts of other birds that the name Alcatraz became widely accepted for use. Though it went largely uninhabited, Spanish explorers did build a few small buildings and minor structures on the island after its discovery. In June of 1846, then Mexican Governor Pio de Jesus Pico gifted the island to Julian Workman. Per their arrangement, Workman would build a lighthouse on the island. It eventually passed into the hands of Francis Temple, who sold it in 1846 to John Fremont, then acting as the military governor of California. Fremont purchased the island for the sum of $5,000 in the name of the United States government. Following the conclusion of the Mexican-American War, with the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo in 1848, United States President Millard Fillmore acquired the island in 1850, a part of the U.S.'s acquisition of California from Mexico for military purposes. Fremont, who owned it in their name, expected a rather large payout for being proactive, but in the end, he received nothing. The population of California, however, boomed. 1849 brought about the beginning of the California Gold Rush. The United States Army even took a more broadened interest in it due to its strategic importance as a coastal battery. This led to the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers fortifying the island up until about 1858. This formed the initial foundations for Fort Alcatraz, or Military Point Alcatraz. Around the end of 1858, the fort welcomed its first full-time inhabitants, 200 U.S. Army soldiers. In 1861, the American Civil War broke out. The battery at Alcatraz Island had 85 cannons, which was expanded to 105 only 5 years later. It doubled as a storage for firearms, as setting it apart from the continent would help prevent them from falling into the hands of citizens loyal to the Confederacy. Arming Alcatraz helped to create a triangle of defense for the mainland, in concert with Fort Point and Lime Point, although Lime Point was never constructed. The lighthouse on Alcatraz Island was also the first operational lighthouse on the west coast of the United States. Over the course of the Civil War, Alcatraz, then, unknowingly to some, would already begin serving its future purpose. The island was used to imprison Confederate sympathizers and even privateers. Its main use as a battery was never realized, with Alcatraz's guns never firing a shot at an enemy. By 1865, the military was also detaining private citizens on the island, with a group that numbered 433 soldiers. Like most conflicts, the U.S. Civil War brought about many new advancements in the field of destruction. A plan was generated to turn Alcatraz into a series of shell-proof underground tunnels and armories, due to its previous defenses fast becoming obsolete. The project started in 1870 and ran through 1876, but was never completed. Today, the parade ground near the southern tip of Alcatraz Island represents the efforts undertaken to flatten it. After the U.S. Civil War finished, the U.S. Army switched gears. Instead of focusing on the coastal defense purposes of the island, they would further its Civil War purpose: detention. After all, it was the perfect place for a prison, due to its isolation and its distance from the mainland. The first jailhouse, a building made of brick, was constructed in 1867, mainly to house Confederate sympathizers, and even some indigenous men into the 1870s. The indigenous men that found their way to Alcatraz were those who refused to send their children to Indian boarding schools in the 1870s. It would continue in its purpose through 1898 with the onset of the Spanish-American War. The general population of the prison swelled from 26 to well over 450 before the turn of the century. In 1906, San Francisco experienced a great earthquake, which forced the city to send a number of its civilian prisoners to the island. In 1909, the island's predominant feature, the concrete cell block, began construction. It was completed 3 years later. The previous military barracks, known as the Citadel, had to be demolished in order to make room for the cell block. It was torn down to the first floor, which then became a basement under the new construction, or, as it was later known, the dungeons. The U.S. Disciplinary Barracks, as it was known before Alcatraz, was stood down on the 12th of October in 1933 and transferred to the Bureau of Prisons. This is where our story begins. In August of 1934, Alcatraz Island was officially designated a federal prison. Arriving at 9:40 a.m. on the 11th, the first 137 prisoners arrived at the island by railroad and then ferry. They were drawn from the U.S. Penitentiary at Leavenworth and escorted, cuffed, and shackled all the way to Alcatraz. Complementing that number were high-security coaches and 60 members of the FBI, U.S. Marshals, and railway security. Let's preface this by saying that the first prisoners to Alcatraz were not good, kind people. The first crew was made up almost entirely of bank robbers and murderers. They were closely watched over by Warden James Johnston and Associate Warden John Shuttleworth, both of whom were considered Iron Men. More simply, the term was used for men who were regarded as tough disciplinarians. Filling out Johnston's staff were Lieutenants E.J. Miller and Paul Madigan from Leavenworth, Edward Starling from Atlanta, and Richard Culver from Virginia. They supervised 52 guards, spread amongst various guard stations and details. They would work in 3 shifts, each with its own color, similar to the Navy. The day shift ran 0700 to 1700 and was yellow. The night shift, 1700 to midnight, and was red, with the last being the morning shift, from midnight to 0700, as green. One of these issues that would cause Alcatraz to be known for being tough as it was the guards' training, being more focused on security rather than rehabilitation. With that being said, the warden wasn't completely heartless. He believed that good, regular food would keep the prisoners from rioting. The prison served 3 square a day, where each inmate could even ask for seconds, provided they finished their first. Good behavior inmates were even allowed to attend movie night, held each month, and could access a library of over 15,000 books and 75 magazine subscriptions. Believe it or not, many inmates even asked to be transferred to Alcatraz for some of those reasons. So as not to get too deep into the operating years of Alcatraz, let me quickly touch on 2 of the more famous inmates. And yes, for those of you that are fans of the Clint Eastwood Escape from Alcatraz movie, I will touch on the stories of Frank Morris and the Anglin brothers. After a life of bootlegging, prostitution rings, gambling, and murder, Al Capone was convicted, of all possible things, on tax evasion. Though the law tried to get Capone behind bars for a long time, it was finally the non-payment of his taxes that did him in. He received a sentence of 11 years in the federal prison system. He began serving time at the Cook County Jail in Chicago, where he had it made. Capone frequently bribed his way to receiving home-cooked meals, expanded telephone privileges, a private cell, and could even receive other inmates for visits, like mobsters Lucky Luciano and Dutch Schultz. He was eventually transferred to Eastern State Penitentiary in Atlanta, where he was known again for bribing guards to get amenities that weren't regular to all inmates. If you ever get the chance to look at Al Capone's former cell there, it's quite lavish. In Atlanta, Capone was able to get his hands on silk underwear, tailored suits, and even got extra recreation time. With that being said, he still had to participate in regular prison routines, like conducting chores and doing laundry. A former inmate even said, Al Capone gets no more privileges than the rest, except that he does not get beaten or thrown into the dungeon. He has too much political influence for that. As it was determined that further correction to his behavior was required, Capone was sent to Alcatraz at the age of 35, where he was gifted a new name, Prisoner 85. Immediately trying to assert dominance and continue his swing of bribery would bring him toe-to-toe with the warden. James Johnston shut Capone down fast and hard to the point that Capone admitted, "It looks like Alcatraz has got me licked." But everything wasn't all doom and gloom for Capone while interred on the rock. After all, he was treated as fairly as everyone else, receiving and being housed in the standard 9x5 cell. Capone was even allowed to have a banjo, which he played in the inmate band known as the Rock Islanders. After petitioning the warden, the band was granted permission to play for 20 minutes per day. It is known that Capone had no prior knowledge or experience playing the banjo, but learned how to read music and play the instrument while incarcerated. It was a small consolation for time spent in between trips to the hole and the monotony of the prison routine. Eventually, Al traded the banjo for an instrument he referred to as a mandola, which may or may not be a mandolin. He did extremely well, boasting in a letter to his son he had a love for show tunes and could even play about 500 songs, writing at least one of those himself. The song was a tribute to his wife, known as Madonna Mia. Inmates would occasionally grow restless and turn on each other. Capone was not sheltered from this. The shower room was especially bad, and Capone himself was even attacked there in 1936 by James Lucas. Al was stabbed with a pair of scissors from the barber shop, but retaliated, still unbeknownst to some how he got a hold of it. But he beat James Lucas with his own mandola. Because of the life he had chosen, Capone had contracted syphilis, which had gone untreated for many years. To remedy this, the prison's doctors attempted to inject him with malaria to raise his temperature and kill the syphilis. Well, this treatment nearly killed Capone. Twice. As it continued to affect his brain, with Capone spending his last days in the institution fluttering between lucid and crazy, it was time to move on. Al Capone was transferred out of Alcatraz after 4.5 years and sent to Terminal Island Prison in Southern California on the 6th of January in 1939. Years later, after his release, he passed away at his home near Miami in 1947. The second of our notable inmates of Alcatraz is Robert Franklin Stroud, better known today as the Birdman. As a young man from a broken home, Stroud ran away from his abusive father in 1903. Only a few years later, he found his way to Alaska and was working as a pimp at only the age of 18. In 1909, he was convicted of manslaughter for killing a bartender that attacked his mistress. He received a sentence of 12 years and was interred on McNeil Island Penitentiary in Washington State. Stroud had a reputation for being a dangerous inmate who had frequent confrontations with both inmates and guards alike. Only a few years after his incarceration began, he killed again, stabbing a guard to death in 1916. Convicted of first-degree murder, Stroud was sentenced to death by hanging. Several trials later, this was commuted to a life sentence in solitary confinement. He was then transferred to Leavenworth. During his time here, Stroud discovered a nest of 3 small sparrows in the yard. As his warden was highly concerned with rehabilitation, Stroud was given equipment and the means to study the birds. He would go on to write 2 books, including The Diseases of Canaries in 1933, which was published when it was smuggled out of the prison. He offered a great amount of research and insight into the field of avian pathology, even generating a cure for hemorrhagic septicemia. Stroud also ran a successful business inside Leavenworth, but was transferred to Alcatraz in 1942 when he was discovered bootlegging. For as interconnected into the birds and the prison as he was, Stroud was only given 10 minutes' notice when it was time to leave. He arrived to Alcatraz on the 19th of December in 1942 and was given inmate number 594 and a psychiatric assessment. He was diagnosed as a psychopath with an IQ of 112. As his birds and equipment weren't allowed to follow him, Stroud focused his energy elsewhere, writing a history of the U.S. penal system. Due to his homosexual tendencies, Stroud often found himself in dog block, or solitary confinement. He was labeled as a wolf, then known in the prison system as an aggressive homosexual with a bad temper. In 1946, The battle for Alcatraz, which we'll touch on in more detail later, erupted and was a multi-day struggle of inmates to escape the island. During this scuffle, police began firing shots into D Block. Stroud climbed over the third-tier railing, lowering himself to the second, and then the floor. He came forward and closed the steel doors to the 6 isolation cells and pleaded with the warden to stop firing into D Block as they had no weapons, and many more would be killed. In all, Stroud spent 17 years in Alcatraz with many failed petitions to be released. In 1959, owing to a rapid decline in his health, he was transferred to the Prison Medical Center in Springfield, Missouri. He passed away on the 21st of November in 1963 at the age of 73. He was known for being disliked by guards and inmates alike, for having a hot temper and being very dangerous. Although Stroud made incredible strides in the field of ornithology, he'll be remembered for being one of the most dangerous criminals in the history of the U.S. prison system. And before we continue, I'll just touch on very quickly the famous escape from Alcatraz. On the 11th of June in 1962, inmate Frank Morris, along with brothers John and Clarence Anglin, were able to escape the prison using various items they stashed away, and used papier-mâché heads in their cells to fool the guards. The 3 were able to escape the island, but whatever became of them is unknown. Almost no evidence washed up on shore, and there was no sign of them ever having reached it, although there is evidence to the contrary. Likely, and the official explanation, is that the 3 men drowned in San Francisco Bay. I won't go into much more detail, as there really isn't much anyway, and I highly advise you to check out Clint Eastwood's Escape from Alcatraz for yourself. It stands the test of time. Another inmate, John Paul Scott, attempted another escape in 1962, and although he made it back to the mainland, he was found unconscious and suffering from hypothermic shock, so he didn't get any farther than shore. Overall, throughout its history, inmates of the prison made 14 escape attempts. These comprised a total of 36 men. 23 were recaptured, 6 were shot and killed, 2 drowned in San Francisco Bay, while 5 went missing. In 1963, Alcatraz closed its doors as a penitentiary. One of the key reasons for the closure was the pure operating cost. By the end, to house a prisoner in Alcatraz, it cost approximately $10 per day, compared to around $3 per day elsewhere. Of course, the infrastructure also took a major beating, with decades of salt water eroding the buildings erected on the island. And with the final straw being the escape attempt by Morris and the Anglins, the decision was made to close. Afterward, the city was petitioned to repurpose the buildings on the island. The year following its closure, it was occupied by a Lakota Sioux indigenous activist group. In 1969, it was further occupied by a group of indigenous rights activists known as the United Indians of All Tribes. Finally, in 1972, it was purchased by the National Park Service and, along with Fort Mason, would form the Golden Gate National Recreation Area. Under U.S. President Richard Nixon, $120 million was allocated for acquisition and land development of that area. Today, the island and former penitentiary are open to tours, with one of the largest hurdles still being the operating costs of the establishment. To give you an idea what day-to-day was like in Alcatraz, I'll defer to an interview conducted in 1968. Reader's Digest spoke with inmate 293, Brian Conway. This is how Brian described things on the rock. The first bell rang at 6 a.m. If it was your day to shave, you laid a matchbox outside the cell grill, and the guard put a razor blade in it. A man had to shave in 2 or 3 minutes, for the blade had to be back on the little shelf when the guard returned. The 6:20 bell was the signal for the count of prisoners, a really serious business which is done every 30 minutes. Breakfast, at 6:30, usually consists of coffee, coffee cake, and cereal. Food at Alcatraz is much better than usual prison fare. For dinner, there is meat, beans, coffee, bread, celery, and for supper, chili, tomatoes, and apples with hot tea. Seated at the same table with me were Machine Gun Kelly, Albert Bates, and others well known to the front page. And although talking is prohibited at meals, the men do manage to speak in a grumbling monotone out the corners of their mouths. I was assigned to work in the laundry, and I received a cordial welcome from the men there when I reported for duty. Al Capone remembered me from Atlanta, but I didn't encourage him. When he tried to give me a magazine, I refused it and said, "Dummy up, Al. Dummy up." This is prison slang meaning, "Don't speak to me." My first day, I encountered the electric device, commonly known as the snitch box, which was designed to detect any metal on the person of prisoners as they passed through it. The only time I ever saw men laughing at Alcatraz prison was over these snitch boxes. One day, the snitch box sounded an alarm on every man who came from the laundry. The guards jerked each man out of line, searched him, and found nothing. It took hours to locate the trouble, which was merely that the machine was so finely adjusted that it was detecting the metal eyelets in the men's shoes. A few days later, it was silent when 2 men passed through with knives in their pockets. The guards don't trust the electric eye. They search every 12th man, whether the alarm has sounded or not. After, we were locked in our cells in the evening, and until lights out at about 9 o'clock. I wouldn't swear to the exact time, because there are no clocks for prisoners at Alcatraz. There was plenty of time for reading. Some magazines are admitted, some are not. The convicts would prefer daily newspapers and detective magazines, which were never allowed. The most prized possessions in Alcatraz are newspaper clippings, which are passed from hand to hand until they're worn out. Most of them concern prison breaks and crimes. We were permitted to write only one letter of not more than 2 pages each week. That had to be to a blood relative. No inmate could write to his sweetheart. We never saw the incoming letters, just copies or rewrites typed at the prison office. Visiting, too, was drastically regulated. No visitor is permitted to shake hands with a prisoner or to touch him. Between prisoner and visitor is a screen and glass, and conversation is carried on by shouting through a tube, one guard standing behind the visitor and another behind the convict. Why do men dread Alcatraz? Because the discipline is as severe as it can possibly be. Literally, you leave all hope behind, for clemency is all but unknown. Only a few short-timers get out. Men go slowly insane under the exquisite torture of restricted and undeviating routine. And not so slowly at that, because out of a total of 317 prisoners, 14 went violently insane during my last year on the Rock. And any number of others were what we call stir-crazy, going about their familiar routine like punch-drunk boxers. With things being so difficult on the Rock, compared to many other institutions around the country, it's not hard to see why men had such a hard time there. But have they moved on? Have all of Alcatraz's former inmates really left its halls? With what I'm about to tell you next, there may just be a few former inmates who returned, or remained at Alcatraz after their passing. Since the time Alcatraz has been in operation, Many strange occurrences have taken place there. Those who have walked its halls on tours in the modern day claim to have felt the presence of a dark, heavy, evil energy that still holds a tight grasp on the prison. From the island's earliest times, when it was used to house Confederate sympathizers and rebellious indigenous men, there have been claims that the island is inhabited by evil spirits. Owing to tribal law at the time, indigenous peoples were often banished to the island and forced to live the rest of their days amongst these evil spirits. One of the spirits who passed away while interred on Alcatraz was said to haunt the island during its peak use. Many inmates claimed to be haunted by the sounds of moaning and whispering after the lights went out, not from other inmates, but otherworldly voices inside the concrete walls. Often, apparitions of these men could be seen, sometimes preceded or accompanied by floating blue lights and the sound of rattling chains. One of the key sounds that can be heard around the halls of the old cell block is the sound of a banjo. As we've previously established, the playing of a banjo at Alcatraz was a favorite pastime of Al Capone. As park rangers make their way through the now deserted halls of the former prison, the eerie sounds of a banjo seem to emanate from the old shower room in the basement, where Capone suffered a serious attack. Though the sounds are distant, they are unmistakably a banjo. Perhaps it's simply Old Al, playing a tune to anyone that might hear, still enjoying his 20 minutes of practice a day by the graces of Warden Johnston. Other sounds that have been experienced by the park rangers include the sounds of cell doors closing, mysterious crashes, disembodied screams, and the constant feeling of being watched. Many have reported these phenomena while there were only one person on the island. Many psychics who have visited Alcatraz claim to have heard and felt the presence of tortured souls still passing through the prison. They are accompanied by strange vibrations from past abuses suffered by inmates. Psychic Peter James even claimed that he had never experienced such a persistent and overwhelming intensity, one that encapsulated the entire island. It wasn't just the inmates that experienced strange things, but there was even phenomena reported by the warden himself, a proclaimed skeptic. Johnston heard many strange things, and saw many strange things during his patrols, on more than one occasion. Even while accompanied by guests touring the facility, he heard the sounds of a woman sobbing, completely out of place, as Alcatraz had no female inmates. Johnston described the sounds as though they were coming from within the walls themselves. Seemingly, as if for no reason, the sobbing stopped, and the group was cut through by a cold wind that rushed past them. Even the warden's house wouldn't be immune to strange occurrences. During one of his Christmas parties, many of his guests noticed a man who appeared out of thin air, dressed in a gray suit, brimmed cap, and had mutton chop sideburns. The guards in attendance didn't know what to make of him, but a cold chill soon followed, and it snuffed out the roaring fire in the warden's Ben Franklin stove. Of course, it was a former place to inter Confederate sympathizers, and gray was the color of the Confederate Army uniforms. This experience only lasted a minute, and the spirit was gone. Today, the foundation and walls of the warden's house still stand on the island, as it was burned out by a fire on the 1st of June in 1970. Like the cell block, other recognizable features on the island were the concrete lighthouse, which has long been demolished. It is said that on foggy nights, the lighthouse will appear and flash with a green light that slips down from the top, slowly making its way around the island, often accompanied by an eerie whistling sound, and vanishes outright rather quickly. Other strange sounds include the firing of cannons, gunshots, and disembodied screaming. With an overview of the phenomena on the island now given, we can move to the true point of interest and discover what still happens in the walls of the cell block as we continue spiraling down in our story to the ones known about the thing. Inside the cell block, where prisoners spent the majority of their time, is riddled with activity. Cell blocks A, B, and C share common phenomena. The sounds of crying and moaning can still be heard throughout, akin to what many prisoners and staff reported in its operating days. One thing that's important is we step back for a moment and re-examine the Battle of Alcatraz in 1946. 3 inmates, Bernard Coy, Marvin Hubbard, and Joe Kretzer, were able to overpower Officer William Miller. They were able to free another inmate, Clarence Carnes. Coy, who had starved himself waiting on the right moment, was able to squeeze between some pried-open bars and access a gun gallery. He was able to gain the upper hand over Officer Bert Birch and tied him up tightly. He lowered down an M1911 pistol, keys, clubs, and gas grenades. Carefully, of course, to keep a Springfield rifle for himself. He was able to force another officer at gunpoint to release around 12 inmates, including co-conspirators Sam Shockley and Miran Thompson. Shockley and Thompson were the only 2 out of the 12 to continue on, as the others returned to their cells. The 6 had plans to escape the prison out of the boat launch, but all was for naught, as they were engaged in a shootout with the other guards. Kretzer shot and wounded 5 officers while they were holding hostages, wounding 3 badly, and killing Bill Miller. Carnes, Shockley, and Thompson returned to their cells, wanting nothing further to do with the shootout. The remaining 3 men didn't surrender. In the ensuing battle, Officer Harold Stiles was killed by friendly fire, and 4 others were wounded. Warden Johnson requested assistance from the U.S. Marines at the nearby naval station Treasure Island, who guarded the prisoners while the situation resolved itself. After a lengthy slew of maneuvers, the U.S. Marines were able to corner the convicts using tactics they learned fighting the Japanese in World War II. Warden Johnson informed them he would accept nothing less than their surrender. The Marines continued to fire into the Cell Block C utility corridor, where the men were trapped until around 2100 on the 3rd. After repeated entry attempts, they would finally enter the corridor around 0940 on the 4th, finding the 3 inmates dead. You might ask, so what? Well, one of the most haunted places in Alcatraz is the Cell Block C utility corridor, where Kretzer, Hubbard, and Coy were gunned down. When visited by a psychic medium and television host, weird things began to happen. The host lost all sense of who he was, almost being unrecognizable. He exhibited so much hatred and anger, and they were able to sense something evil below their feet. Also in Cell Block C, there is an unseen presence in the laundry room. Described by psychic Sylvia Brown, he is a tall man with a bald head and beady eyes. The man told her he remembered Butcher, a former mafia hitman named A.B. Maldowitz. Maldowitz was killed in Alcatraz Cell Block C's laundry room when Brown held a seance to attempt to get Butcher to leave. his spirit refused. Finally, we come to the worst area of all, Cell Block D, Dog Block, the treatment unit. Cell Block D was made up of 42 cells, which were meant to house those who weren't allowed contact with the general population. 36 of the cells were ultimately no different than those in Gen Pop, but the inmates were not allowed a work detail, nor were they allowed to attend meals in the mess hall. Every meal was served to them in their cells. Per week, they were allowed to visit the recreation yard only once, and shower twice. To make things worse, the cells faced the Golden Gate Bridge, where cold winds would often blow in from. One cruel guard in D Block was even known to bump up the air conditioning, making things even colder. 5 D Block cells were known as strip cells, or to the inmates, the hole. These cells had only a sink, a toilet, and a dim light bulb. During the day, the inmate's mattress would be removed, and they were not afforded rec time or anything to read. A stay in the hole could be as long as 19 days of isolation and boredom. These were reserved for the worst of the worst, but there was ultimately one last cell that was a pit of despair. The Oriental, as it was known, was more or less a steel box with a hole in the floor for bathroom activities. Each inmate staying in the Oriental was placed in there naked, given a diet of bread and water, and the cell was pitch black at all times. They would be given a mattress at night, but like the other cells had it taken away during the day. The longest stay in the Oriental was 24 to 48 hours maximum. The most haunted place in the entire prison are cells 12 and 14D in D Block, an area noted by psychics and sensitives alike for holding a great amount of psychic energy. At one point, cell 14D was home to Ruth McCain, an inmate who attempted to escape and was thrown into the hole in cell block D for 3 years. Then, as soon as he was released, murdered another inmate. McCain claimed that whatever was in that cell did irreparable damage to his psyche. He was acquitted on the death of the other inmate, having been left in the hole for 3 years. That cell gives most who walk into it sensations of tingling about their body, and some have even encountered a man who stated he had been beaten and had his legs broken by the guards. When ghost hunter Richard Sennett visited Alcatraz, he intended to spend the night. He locked himself in cell 12D. After reports, there was an evil spirit making its home there. As the steel bars slammed shut, he experienced the wrap of ice-cold fingers around his neck and received a vision of twisted bodies and dismembered men. Let's at last speak of the thing of Alcatraz Island. In the 1940s, the guards in D Block would often notice the apparition of a man in older prison attire who would walk about the area of the strip cells. On one occasion, an inmate locked in the hole for only a short time started screaming. He pleaded with the guards to get him out, as there was something with glowing eyes that was in there with him. The guards thought nothing of it, for sightings of their spectral guest were so frequent, they ignored him. He continued screaming well into the night, when all of a sudden, total silence. When the guards inspected the cell the following morning, they found the inmate dead, with a terrible, eerie expression on his face and strange marks around his neck. An autopsy would later reveal the death induced by strangulation was not self-inflicted. No guard ever admitted to it, even in passing conversation. or amongst themselves. But the inmate's spirit never left, for in days following, his body showed up for the morning count. When it was noticed that one too many inmates were standing in line, guards and prisoners looked on astonished. The recently departed inmate vanished before their very eyes. It wasn't the first time the thing of Alcatraz has appeared to guards and inmates. The entity only described with glowing red eyes. The entire history of Alcatraz contributes to it being a horrible place. From being essentially an initial penal colony to the construction of arguably one of the most well-known prisons in history, it has experienced nothing but feelings of sadness, isolation, and has even contributed to many deaths. It's easy to see how many spirits haunt the island and the former cell block that many inmates called home. Needless to say, there's a reason why Alcatraz scares so many visitors and park rangers still to this day. Quite possibly, whatever evil presence now calls Alcatraz home, in the deepest cells and the darkest tunnels of the island, is just waiting for you to come and visit. And with this message, we bring to close the story of Alcatraz and the haunted history of one of the most iconic islands and prisons our world has ever known. I'd like to take this moment to thank you for listening and choosing the Insidious Agenda podcast. Before you go, don't forget to leave us a quick review and ensure you're subscribed so you don't miss any of the amazing stories I have coming your way. Like next Tuesday, when we'll take a deep dive into the ocean and attempt to locate the lost city of Atlantis. New episodes of the podcast release every Tuesday at 5 a.m. Eastern Standard Time. But for now, it's time to close the cover of the Insidious Agenda. I'll see you again next week, and thank you for coming back.